to Maria's talk, Mothers in Arms, Biji Mama, as a civic subject. Welcome.
Thank you. All right, I have to warn you that this won't be a profound theoretical talk. I've left that job to the heavy lifters among us, like Peter Dahlgren and his notion of civic culture and all the theoretical build-up that he has put there. I'm going to tell you a story. And my modest hope is that with this story, I will be able to illustrate how civic cultures work in actual practice. And curiously, I find that my story will touch on some of the issues that Lisbeth just talked about. So I'll have to interpret that into my story on the go. Hopefully, I'll be able to do that. So as you can see, my title is about a group of mothers that stood up in arms to fight for something that I construe, and they themselves construed, as a civic cause. And the arms that they used weren't exactly the ones that I've illustrated there. I've put up this picture simply because I love it. Their arms were different. They were slogans, postcards, concert shows, and all the arsenal of radical media, so-called, that these mothers intuitively turned to when they wanted to defend what they perceived as their children's right to a future free of genetically modified organisms or foods. So in this lady's hands, you see a poster that says, "We're the real Ministry of the Environment and Waters," which is this ultimate gesture of civil society trying to take over the institutions. And this is one of the main organizers of the civic protest that I will talk about. I've interviewed her, so part of her story will be woven into my story. What is Bakardjieva Mama? I'll talk about it. I'll pronounce it the way it's pronounced in Bulgarian. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. My story comes from Bulgaria. So normally, nothing interesting happens in countries like that. Social life usually occurs in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom. What goes on there, it is about humanity. What happens in countries like Bulgaria, Sweden, excuse me, maybe among these smaller players, it's regional, it's local, it's best object of ethnographic interest of sorts. It's like those remote islands that Margaret Mead studied. But in my story, I hope to convince you that, in fact, what happened in Bulgaria is about the world. It is about humanity. And Bulgaria is interesting in terms of civic cultures, too, because from the perspective of all formal parameters or indicators of civil society, Bulgaria is a wasteland. There is a nice book written by an American political scientist called Mark Howard, who talks about the weakness of civil society in post-communist countries. And Bulgaria fits all the description that he gives there. How people are disappointed in the transition, how they don't trust organizations because they were forced to belong to organizations under communism, and how their networks of family and friends are still the dominant collective force in their lives, so they cannot sort of leave those behind and join voluntary associations, as they're called, NGOs and so on. So membership in those organizations is minimal. And because of that, civil society is weak, it is mute, it does not participate much in any political decision making, which is to a large extent true. But hey, here come the new media. And at the risk of being a or seen as a technological determinist, which I am convinced I'm not, some interesting things start happening. So what is Bakardjieva Mama? Begi Mama is a discussion site that started in 2002. And initially it was all about motherhood, all about pregnancy, how you feel in the 2nd week, in the 9th week, and what vitamins you should or should not take. Later on, about baby food, about diapers, about fluoride in water or in milk, or all about motherhood. And it grew up as a site that really covered the whole motherly and even grandmotherly career of the women involved. As of March 2011, actually as of last night, there were 17 million, over 70 million posts on that site. Well, 150 almost registered users. That number has fluctuated, has been higher than that as well. Over the years, the site has grown into a vibrant online community, although I will point out later that we don't really have the right words to talk about such kinds of entities. I'm not sure it's a community, because in it, quarrel and disagreement is as common as an intense as agreement and support and solidarity. However, all its members find it to be a hospitable environment, an environment where they can find out about how to be mothers, find support in some of their difficulties and quests around their children and families, and they keep coming back to it for that kind of support and for that kind of friendly, supportive conversation. Now, interestingly enough, out of this diaper talk, some really important civic initiatives have emerged. Now, these mothers got together around a case where they saw a documentary about children, abandoned children with disabilities who were cared for in homes dedicated to that, who live there under abject conditions. That's what the documentary revealed. And out of the indignation, emotional reaction these mothers had to the fact, they went out and organized a campaign of charity to help these homes, but more than that, the charity gradually transformed into a quest to change state policy around children with disability who have been abandoned by their families. They went to exert pressure over institutions to fundamentally change the way they dealt and took care of those children. Very important victory for them was achieved in result of, again, organized campaign for increase of child benefits and maternity leave term. They went out on protest with their carriages, and it is argued that the government at the time was going to go ahead with these changes anyway, but those changes were stalled and taking forever to be implemented. Now, once those mothers with their strollers went out to protest, things started moving faster. Now Bulgaria has a very reasonable package of child and maternity benefits. Affordable daycare centers in cities. Many people will say that daycare is one of those personal issues that every family and every mother is often facing on their own, and even in competition with other mothers and parents who opt for the same place in the daycare. But those mothers came out again together and organized a campaign to insist that they have the right to access to daycare spaces in the cities where they lived, and pressured local governments, municipalities to put more resources into the creation of these spaces, which in the end of the day is indeed a fundamental political question of women's right to that kind of support, which would then allow them to pursue other forms of realization and employment and independence. So finally, just very recently in 2010, these mothers managed to stop the planned amendments of a law regulating that was going to liberalize the regime for genetically modified organisms in Bulgaria. And that campaign actually became the object of my focused study that I'm going to draw on when I reflect on what the actions and example of that site and the mothers can teach us, can tell us about civic cultures. I use a couple of concepts to make sense of this case. Of course, the overarching is civic culture, and I wouldn't be here if I wasn't subscribing and finding that kind of framework interesting and fruitful in my analysis. I have done my modest efforts to add to the civic culture framework some concepts that have emerged out of my empirical observations of a number of cases like the one that I'm talking about. And one of them is my concept of subactivism. I define subactivism as a level of citizenship and political engagement that happens below the surface. I mimic, to some extent, Ulrich Beck's distinction between politics and subpolitics, where he talks about politics of formal institutions and then subpolitics of social movements and all that. To me, subactivism is a layer that is subjective and submerged in the flow of everyday life. This is people positioning themselves with regard to public and political discourses as they talk to their friends and family, as they make decisions about what products to buy or where to go on vacation, whether to recycle, and all these kinds of things. And interestingly, with new media, we get access to what goes on in people's everyday lives. All these forums where people discuss politics, like in the examples Lisbeth was giving, on sites related to shows or to journal articles and newspaper articles, or in the forums that are open out there for political discussion. We find that a lot of what Chantal Mouffe would call subject positioning goes on, immersed in everyday life, where people think of themselves, position themselves with respect to this discourse or to this contested issue. But we don't learn about it because this type of civic engagement remains hidden. It remains under the surface. With new media, we get a glimpse of those moves and those acts of positioning. Now, what I want to call mundane citizenship is the stage where these acts of subactivism start creeping out to the surface. Those are forms of citizenship and civic engagement, very often political engagement, which are not counted under the membership in voluntary organization or being an activist. This whole notion of activist, to me, is problematic, has to be unpacked. Who are these people who are activists? It sounds almost like there's some kind of professionals pursuing this thing, while everybody else is not an activist. Now, with acts of mundane citizenship, within their everyday lives, people start to join causes, to contribute to certain arguments or discourses or actions by small, almost indistinguishable moves, which are still related to what they do on a daily basis, to their mundane existence, and yet they start showing up on the surface. And the surface, I want to think about as what Roger Silverstone has called the mediapolis. This is, in his definition, the mediated space of appearance in which the public world happens. The public world is constituted for us. He says that it's our kind of second-order paramount reality. And the idea of paramount reality comes, of course, from phenomenological sociology, the fact that every day we wake up in a world that we think we know, and that's our mundane world that we can touch and act in, well, Silverstone has argued that the same way that we